Hello, my name is Allie Boak. I'm the director of the Global Center on Human Trafficking here at Montclair State University. We are pleased to present to you this very timely and important webinar. I hope you enjoy it and learn a lot.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's panel discussion on the reality of human trafficking in the era of misinformation, organized by the Center on Global Human Trafficking to fuel important and critical debates on issues that affect our local communities and impact us as a transnational society on a global level. The focus of this particular event lies on scrutinizing the connections between the politics of information dissemination, or as we've accurately put in our title, mis and disinformation, with Pizzagate, QAnon, and the former US President's tax return issues, all as excellent examples in this scope. And then, of course, the connection between disinformation and large global patterns of anti-feminist oppression in the context of transnational labor and organized crime, and systemic genderized and race-based injustice in different criminal justice systems to cope with these challenges. To tackle these large questions, I'm joined today by an excellent panel, including Montclair State faculty, as well as guests from the University of Massachusetts, Boston. I'll briefly introduce them in alphabetical order before jumping into our first part of our conversation, which consists of framing some of these issues by asking each participant a couple of questions that tie in with these overarching themes and have them express their thoughts based on their research, their experience, and their expertise. They have each about 5 minutes for this before we move on to part 2 of the roundtable, which consists of another series of questions in which each panelist responds to how best to move forward to address some of these issues. Each panelist will again have several minutes to reflect before we then open up to Q&As from the public. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists in alphabetical order. And we have just Fazia Afzal Khan of the Department of English here at Montclair, who's joined us with initial technical difficulties, but we're glad to have her here. And her writings and work on feminist theory, cultural and performance studies, and post-colonial studies, with a recent book, The Siren Song, published by Oxford University Press, where she's trying to understand Pakistan through the lens of its women singers. It's just one of many examples how her work just spans transnationally and globally on these themes. And second, we have Bon Benton from the School of Communication and Media here at Montclair, whose work on culture, media, and misinformation, more recently on QAnon, is really a fitting starting point for that conversation. And I'm glad to have him here from sort of this media perspective, where sort of digital literacy should be really spelt with a capital D and capital L, and we're glad to hear some of his thoughts. And then our esteemed outside guest, Sudeshna Chatterjee from the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and her work and extensive field work on the ground in Kolkata in India on global gender, race, and ethnic politics, trying to also tackle the question of global governance and transnational organized crimes, are really a great segue, tying this into also global activism, social activism, and mobilization in broader Southeast Asia. And I look forward to also having her in our conversation. And last but not least, Venice Michelson from my own department here in Justice Studies at Montclair, and her work on sort of historical anti-feminism and human trafficking is very fitting and relevant. And sort of these questions of fear of the other and moral panic that have been more recently been created in that context is really something that's important. And while many of her books that she's written tie in more on a domestic question with regards to gender and our justice system here and the inequality, I think her issues that she addresses here span also cross-regionally and cross-disciplinary and intersectionality. She teaches in the Women and Gender Studies program at Montclair are certainly very important in this conversation. And please welcome our esteemed panelists with me today. And I just want to—
Dad, I'm busy, please. Thank you.
Open up here. No worries. Hi, Fazia.
Hi, sorry.
I'm very excited, and we'll jump right in with these introductions. I would really like to open up our first part of the conversation here, trying to frame these issues. And we'll start with the overall context of the state of our US democracy, right? Misinformation and the QAnon phenomenon. And so I want to start with Bond and sort of open up with a broader question for our listeners who are not so familiar with the QAnon phenomenon and its emergence and the significance in US, but also global politics. Could you tell us a little bit more about what is QAnon and how did it emerge? And then in this context, make this link for today's panel discussion. How does QAnon tie in with global human trafficking? The floor is all yours, and we look forward to your insights. Thank you.
I want to talk just a little bit about answering that question, and I provide a little bit of context that I hope will help bring this forward for everyone here, that will be developed a little bit more from some of the subsequent speakers. And in general, my work looks at kind of a hidden agenda, QAnon, and how they play a massive role in trafficking misinformation. And just as kind of a starting point for this, I ask a question myself, right? Like I answer a question with a question. You're not supposed to do that, but I'm going to do it anyway. How did we get here, right? Like I really don't know. The first little item you'll see there is about a woman who is in a Home Depot, and she felt her daughter was about to be accosted by someone driving a secret Toyota Camry. And this is a known car for the sex traffickers. Another one is a Facebook post about all the celebrities who are about to be arrested for trafficking children. And the one on the far right you'll see is about how Wayfair, the furniture company, names their furniture pieces after the victims that they've captured, these child trafficking victims. Like this is what they've actually done, is they believe that they've named their pieces after this. And how do we get here? This is like, sound fundamentally crazy, right? Like this seems like sort of random, like that it wouldn't pass the Turing test. Like these are just sort of randomly constructed memes. Are they part of like a larger thing? They actually are. How do we get here? And largely, I think the internet is to blame by the very nature of its format. The internet is a meme space, and I have compiled a few of the greatest hits there in terms of what have been, like famous internet memes that you might actually remember. And it's a space where virally disseminated messages happen all the time, and the absurd is really commonplace. And why is it a meme space? What draws people into these kinds of memes? Plotnick argues that anything that really generates intense emotion is going to get traction. We'll come to back that in just a second, but human trafficking obviously is an emotional flashpoint, right? So the fact that we would get memes associated with it and a meme movement, kind of like QAnon, shouldn't be terribly surprising. The space almost invites it. The viral nature of content really invites remixing and reinterpretation, and that's great. It can be really, really funny. Here's an example of how it can look funny. The British Research Council invited the internet to name an Antarctic explorer boat that they were building. And everybody thought that they would name it something supreme and regal to celebrate the importance of fundamental research into global warming. They thought it would be great. Here's what the internet named it. The internet named it Boaty McBoatface. Taking what was a very serious topic, global warming, science, a research vessel, and they turned it into a meme, right? Like this happens sort of all the time. And this co-optation of message can be funny, kind of like that. But the co-optation places on the internet. And this is what we research pretty extensively with my research colleague and my wife, Daniela Paterka-Benton. In our 2002 research, we coined the term hate jacking. And this is where extremists co-opt space, allowing for hidden messages to be snuck out under the guise of something else, right? And our research gained traction kind of nationally as an explanatory device for some of the reasons why the January 6th Capitol riot happened, right? Like this was like taken into the larger context in relation to that. And here are just a few examples of it. If you look at the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally, in which Heather Hare was killed, an anti-fascism activist was killed at this riot. The people at this riot were kind of saying the worst, most awful things you can imagine, and were carrying tiki torches. The tiki torch, a backyard fixture, totally harmless, all of a sudden became a hate symbol utilized by these groups. And here's just another very simple, quick one for you. And people were asking for refunds because they didn't want tiki torches in their yards anymore because they thought it was a hate symbol. And here's kind of another example of where this happens. Somebody posted to Wendy's hilariously irreverent Twitter feed, got any memes? Wendy's responded by posting their mascot with the signature red-haired wig, but using Pepe the Frog. They didn't know anything about this. They thought it was a funny online thing. They just shared it without thinking. But as it turns out, Pepe the Frog has become a symbol of concern by the Anti-Defamation League, as it's a hate symbol at this point. And the Daily Stormer, a hate website, said that Wendy's has now officially endorsed fascism, right? Banal message, co-opted by the bad guys. This is happening in human trafficking with QAnon, right? Like this is really happening with QAnon. QAnon is, to sort of answer the initial question, it is a loosely organized network of believers around unsubstantiated beliefs. But there's a belief that there's an insider named Q who has all the answers. And it really does all center around the view that there's a cabal of Satan worshiping pedophiles out there, that global elites are capturing children. And that's the foundation of this. And while it's not really overt, it is a wildly anti-Semitic theory as well. The majority of the figures that they target are Jewish. The concept of the global elite kidnapping, sexually sacrificing children, that is known as the blood libel, and it's really, really an old thing that has been used to demonize the other for a very long time. This message of QAnon is fundamentally a white supremacist message, but they don't lead with white nationalism. Instead, they lead with nice hashtags like save the children. Don't you want to save the children? You click on that link on a Facebook page, all of a sudden you are pulled down the rabbit hole of learning about Q and all of the hundreds of thousands of children that are abducted for sexual slavery every week. And the hashtag so overwhelmed the platform that Facebook actually had to ban its use. They also targeted mom groups. They tried to get moms who care about kids drawn into this, and it was pretty effective by using these hashtags once again. Their safe space all of a sudden became a conspiracy space. And we're going to get into this, I think, a lot more with some of the other speakers today. This seems really new and novel. It's not. QAnon has been around for a long time. QAnon continues the long history of sexualizing human trafficking when there are other forms of trafficking that we need to discuss. QAnon uses trafficking myths of the other, corrupting virginal white Christian girls. Again, not new. I have the picture of D.W. Griffith's racist epic Birth of a Nation to the right. This was sort of the proto-QAnon showing freed slaves abducting white women, right? It was so powerful that it inspired the second rise of the Ku Klux Klan. It is very, very common with this. QAnon also precludes the possibility of autonomy. Women who are voluntarily sex workers are not included in the conversation. We either have clear villains and we have clear victims in the QAnon narrative, right? Like this is how it's constructed. Like the old myths of trafficking, only mythical victims, defined villains, and paternalistic protectors exist. The paternalistic protectors in this case believe themselves to be the people who are going to listen to QAnon and stop the bad guys, right? Like this is what has emerged here. And as we've seen with the number of people in the Capitol riots that were affiliated with QAnon, the danger that this poses is not hypothetical, it's profound. And it's something that I hope other speakers will be able to kind of contextualize, that these old myths about trafficking are very much present here as well.
Great. Thank you. Thank you so much for this fantastic overview. for those who have not had a chance to really wrap their heads around QAnon and the phenomenon and how it ties into human trafficking, and how this is certainly more historic than we think it is, trendy and novel. And I want to sort of shift our conversation to some of the topics that you brought up. This trope of the victim is certainly something with regards to victimology that has come up in Venice's work, and some of the issues here tie into this. And I want to give her a chance to share some of her views and thoughts of how anti-feminist and misogyny is deeply rooted in the paradigm and practice of global human trafficking. So you could use some of Bon's work to jump right into that and springboard here. So floor is all yours, Venice, and you
Thank you. Yeah,
7
and
minutes to do so. Thanks.
Bon, that was just beautifully done. Thank you for that very interesting segue. Nicely done segue. You know, I had a bunch of things that I wanted to talk about. I don't have a PowerPoint, but a bunch of things that I think are important to talk about given what Bon was talking about. The first thing is about use of data. So the sort of anti-scientific piece of the QAnon phenomenon really plays into this idea of human trafficking, and what he mentioned as well about this focus on women and on sex trafficking, whereas trafficking is actually far wider than just sex and just young white girls, like in the movie Taken. But you know, a huge piece of what we know about human trafficking is that we know very little about human trafficking when it comes down to it. Our data are very problematic for a variety of reasons. It's a multinational problem, a global problem, and the fact that we don't have common definitions of trafficking causes real problems for our ability to measure it. So always question, right? And many of my students are here today, and I'd like to sort of remind them of what we talked about last week in class, but this question of always questioning numbers and where numbers are coming from, and the fact that we really don't know, you know, very much about how much human trafficking is actually happening. We certainly know about prosecutions that don't happen very often, but in terms of what's actually happening, who is and who is being victimized, we really don't know as much as QAnon would lead us to believe. So I always want to make that sort of, or anyone else, right? It's not just QAnon. Frankly, it's, you know, your neighbor, or when the Super Bowl was happening in New Jersey, and I think it was Chris Christie got on TV and started telling us to watch out for human trafficking all over New Jersey, right? We know very little when people seem very confident about the numbers. Only believe confident people when they're telling you that we don't know very much. So I was also reminded of Cynthia Enloe, an author who wrote about women and children as one word, right? Imagine women and children just written as one word. I recently have been imagining it with a hashtag in front of it because it's sort of perfect for hashtagging. Her idea was, or sort of her point, not idea, her point was that we lump together women and children as if they are the same, that we view women and children as a monolith of helpless people that we need to save. And we imagine them as white, certainly not as an other, and that we need to protect women and children as if they were the same thing. And I'd like to make sure that people are problematizing that when you're lumping them together, recognizing that, you know, we're lumping together adults with children. And Cynthia Enloe was asking us to also question that. So a big piece of what I like to talk about when I talk about human trafficking is actually the sort of how feminism is actually far more complicated than just one monolith of feminism, and that white feminists and their sort of backing of the Violence Against Women Act, in fact championed by now President Biden many years ago now, that focus on victims and that focus on serving victims and using the criminal justice system in a punitive way to take care of victims, it ends up being very problematic when it comes to sex trafficking. So I'll move on to the next person. Thank you.
Okay, very good.
Thank you so much. And so I'll give it sort of a quick wrap up if you don't mind, because we're shifting now to Fazia's presentation, and she will certainly take it to a broader global level. So we're shifting from US to Southeast Asian politics, and her work, as I said, is deeply embedded in sort of anti-feminist repression. And so I think it'll be really great if you could give us a broader overview of anti-trafficking laws, and how we can build that anti or misogynistic discourse from sort of a post-colonial lens also that has also fostered these repression also from an ethnic and racial lens. Go ahead.
Okay, so thank you. I actually have, I'm trying also to do something very similar to Venice and Bond in terms of the notion of connecting the dots between seemingly unrelated issues, right? And so I'm going to talk a little bit about those connections between discourses of white slavery and human sex trafficking, right, that both have pointed out to, as well as then I think I'm going to talk about widening the scope to connect the dots between these, what I would call really Orientalist discourses. And that's of course a term that comes from, my scholarly lens, which is post-colonialism, because all of these are rooted in colonial and imperialist imaginaries, right? These ways of thinking about these issues. And we have to see how the way that we fetishize sex trafficking, for example, when we think of the larger term, human trafficking, right? That comes at the expense of not looking at other forms of trafficking, which include obviously labor trafficking that also affects not just women, but also men. We don't talk about that as much, right? It's just not that sexy. I mean, in terms of numbers, which we need to definitely, be skeptical about, some numbers more recently in 2018 point to the fact that, there are more men now being trafficked and girl victims rather than adult women. So yeah, we have to look at the changing landscape. And I think the question Venice asked was excellent, is how big of a problem is it, and whose problem is it being framed as, right? And who is going to go out and save these victims? So underwriting those questions is this notions, right? The twin notions of fear and desire of the other. Bond referred to this, a concept of the other that underwrites QAnon's ideology. And American Orientalism really is a thing, right? We have to think about it. It's not just European, in the past colonialism, but American. And I want to just quickly draw your attention to the fact that in the early 20th century, there were a lot of people from South Asia being dubbed Hindus, even though there were Muslims and Christians and what have you, Sikhs coming in. A lot of them were coming in. It's not a well-known fact, but they were coming in enough numbers that there was a hue and cry. There were various organizations that were created, such as the Asiatic Exclusion League, which was promoting the idea, and I'm quoting here from Vivek Bald, who is a historian, that a nefarious horde of Hindus was about to swamp the United States. And then that becomes national in scope, that claim. And it starts to include, these made up fantasies of thousands of Indian and Chinese seamen, mostly, Muslims from Bangladesh, contemporary Bangladesh, that they are jumping ships, smuggling drugs, and engaging in human trafficking through northeastern ports. So then the metaphor of disease enters the picture, right? And so the reaction is, well, we need to be preventing this from happening, taking those women off. Maybe they are diseased and carrying sexual disease, or else we need to rescue those women, right? And who are they rescuing them from? It's that saying that was made famous by a post-colonial feminist, Gayatri Spivak, we're trying to save brown women from brown men. And this still is part of that ideological framing that underwrites a lot of our contemporary thinking around human trafficking and moving it towards just looking at sex trafficking. Indian immigrants were then portrayed, therefore, as a looming threat to the United States. There was an Asiatic barred zone, etc. But at the flip side of this is a desire, which I mentioned, for the exotic East. So suddenly, there are images of dusky nautch girls appearing and, men smoking cigarettes. It was a way to sell cigarettes to the American public, to try to lure them into thinking they might have harems if they smoked cigarettes, and belly dancing craze in the West, and so on and so forth. And so it's those twin impulses of fear and desire that I think underwrite the global economy around human sex trafficking particularly. And it's the same thinking that has driven and structured race relations and racism directed at African Americans, because we have the example of the 1910 Mann Act, which was known as the White Slave Traffic Act, right? That was passed by the United States, and it was supposed to keep or help keep innocent girls from being lured into prostitution. But what it really did was to make criminal many different kinds of actually consensual sexual activity that were occurring between consenting white women and Black men. And one of the early victims, of course, was the boxer Jake Johnson, the Black American boxer Jake Johnson. So this is an important ideological background to keep in mind when I hope in the next round, what I would like to do is to call your attention to the ways in which this ideological background of American Orientalism and European Orientalism, right, with its roots in colonial and imperialist policies, how it shapes the geopolitical realities that point to the endemic and ongoing structural global issues. What are those structural global issues? They are issues that have largely to do with the economic imbalance between rich and poor nations, right? The global North and the global South. And within them, the ever-growing gap between those who have and those who have not, which is a result of the neoliberal globalization regime that has been forced on the whole world. And as capitalism morphs into ever more virulent forms of economic virus, right, like COVID, it is contributing. All those factors, economic, majorly amongst them, are contributing to the industry we call human trafficking. And so in the next round, I'll take this and talk a little bit about a play that I studied, which tracks the movement of, or follows the story of women trafficked from Bangladesh across India by land and into Pakistan on their way to, other destinations, and connect, right, these dots, the nexus between what I have called our contemporary unholy trinity, not a holy trinity, but the unholy trinity of postmodern capitalism, which is connected to the rise of so-called Islamic and other religious fundamentalisms. And obviously, patriarchy is the third prong of this unholy trinity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fazia. And I'm just fascinated by how we were able to connect these dots. And before I hand it over to Sadeshna, maybe just in terms of what you said about fear and desire, for those who have a desire to read up on some of the latest work, a colleague called Nicola Smith has just published with Oxford Capitalism's Sexual History, that really ties into the tropes that Fazia mentioned here, and that really teases and deconstructs some of these notions, because these are really at play and are highly, highly problematic. And so I want to bring that, I look really forward to round two also to flesh out the autistic parts of it. And maybe I should also use different wording, right? Fleshing out is also very loaded in these terms. So let's use teasing out. And I wanna go really very much into the deep field work that Sadeshna has done in her area. And I'm very much looking forward into hearing some of your experiences, how on the ground you've watched and observed these things, and tie that in also with regards to activism and promoting more of an empowering discourse, right? In your work as a researcher, but then also as an activist and someone that cares. So the floor is all yours, and
Thank you.
I
think the panelists have very beautifully conceptually set up the debate. So I'm going to get right to the field research. So I worked between 2016 to 2017. That's when I conducted my field research. And I worked with basically 3 groups of organizations. One was like government bodies and the national and state level ministries. The other were anti-trafficking NGOs. And the third group was sex work activists. And basically the subject matter of this entire panel is my dissertation. So I will try to keep it very brief. But I'm going to primarily kind of focus on one aspect which speaks out, which is how sex workers, that is the concerned subject group, kind of perceive and construct anti-trafficking narratives. So in my field research, I spoke to 2 groups of sex work activist organizations. One was the DMSC Sangram in Kolkata, and the other is based out of Mumbai, which is the VAMP Sangram group. And they're both headed and kind of driven, the agenda is driven by sex workers themselves. So that's great to watch. And from my conversations with these organizations, what I found was that there is a very polarizing tendency when it comes to governing sexual commerce in a country like India. So there's a very clear demarcation between the government organizations, which tend to side with anti-trafficking NGOs, and then there are sex worker activist groups, which are basically kind of bargaining decriminalization through changing the anti-trafficking laws. So in India, more specifically, and Fauzia spoke a little bit about this, the anti-trafficking laws are not existing in vacuum. They're highly gendered and racialized. They were formulated during the British colonial rule. So there's that clear reflection of British anxiety, and like she said, basically trying to save brown women from brown men. A lot of the laws, not just anti-trafficking laws, but a lot of the penal codes which regulate sexuality, for example, the LGBTQ regulations were derived from British era laws. So this is the legal administrative landscape that sex workers are confronted with. Sex work itself is not illegal in India, but organized brothel-based prostitution is. And the sex workers I interviewed were all commercial sex workers. And one of the things they brought up, very interestingly, was how the law and policies, including the tonality of the government, reflects a few gendered assumptions, specifically focusing on consent and coercion, which kind of conflate commercial sex work exclusively with sex trafficking and kind of ignore any kind of conversation on sex work activism. So I remember I was in New Delhi speaking to the minister of this minister's spokesperson in the Ministry of Women and Child Welfare. And I asked him about how the government views sex work activist organizations. And he basically just shoved the question aside. He was not ready to engage with it at all. And he said that we only recognize sex trafficking victims. So the idea here is that you're either victimized, you've been trafficked and you want to be rescued, but if you do not want to be rescued, then you're kind of criminalized and cast aside. And here through my interviews, and this is how I frame a lot of my work, is basically looking at this consent coercion binary, right? So a lot of times when sex workers who actively engage in commercial sex work and they refuse to be mainstreamed, go to the police or go to the hospital to get healthcare or try to get the protection of their rights, they're confronted with this kind of systemic invisibility. The idea here is that well, if you chose to stay in the profession and not get mainstreamed, then we can't help you because you chose it. And if you chose a profession, then how can you face violence within that space? So the idea here is that consent is irreversible, it is unconditional and absolute. And hence the accountability factor for kind of looking at which systemic factor or individual factors kind of lead to gender violence for sex workers in India almost always goes back and blames the consenting sex worker who refused to be rescued. On the global level too, and a lot of the laws and the political practices are basically kind of shadow the global governance aspect of transnational crime. So the leading UN body, the UNODC, defines and views human trafficking through a very transnational organized crime lens, which I think, as the term indicates, is a very criminology focused perspective. And a lot of the discourses on transnational organized crime kind of received an impetus post 9/11. So a lot of things like terrorism and human trafficking were kind of conflated together and viewed typically as something that threatens border security and human security. And like I said, through my conversation with sex workers in India, it's very interesting to see how the concerned subject group, and here I think it's safe to assume that a lot of commercial sex workers in India are trafficked into brothels, but a lot of them still refuse to kind of go into mainstream programs by the government, which they find problematic due to a number of reasons, precisely because of these gendered, classist, casteist assumptions that underlie these policies and laws.
Great. Thank you so much, Sudashni. That was very, very inspiring. And I want to move on now to sort of round two, where we have a chance to get a bit more practical, right? Sudashni can certainly address questions of how we tackle this then also from a legal perspective. And you do have already a question that I will pose, either if you get to it through the Q&A chat. If you can't see it, I will pose it in our Q&A session so that we can answer that question here. So I'm glad our panel here is already inciting and fueling so many reactions and questions with this regard. But I want to go back to our initial speaker, Bond, and see what he has to say in terms of what the media's responsibility is in this regard, and how sort of disinformation campaigns can be coped with, especially with regards to, as he nicely laid out, with regards to right-wing extremism, right? In his presentation, we've seen it from Charlottesville over to the storming of the Capitol. So what is our duty? What is the state's duty? And so maybe you can give us some guidance, directions, and thoughts on that.
Probably the biggest thing that I think is more crucial than anything to keep in mind is that we have done a reasonably good job, I think, of in the last, I don't know, like a couple of months, actually. There was a sudden awareness that we need to deplatform overt voices of hate, right? Like that if you have overt hate voices, and people can say open marketplace of ideas, but these ideas were inciting, right? And that no platform is obligated to host content that can incite. Like there's no obligation to that. And you're finally seeing some platforms take aggressive stances where if the content you're putting out is going to inspire people to violence, going to wrap them up in a conspiracy that's going to make them hate their neighbors and view like different groups as suspect, and to go out and sort of attack people because you believe that they're trafficking, shooting up a pizza restaurant or something like that. Like that, we don't want to platform that anymore, and that's, I think, a positive step. But per usual, we're a little bit behind the curve. I think this could have been done some time ago. Like the dangers were fairly obvious. The fact that it took so long for people to realize that it was dangerous, I think is somewhat telling, right? Like that so long as people posting about QAnon are authentic users, they can be monetized, right? Like, so it took, something like the Capitol insurrection for people to realize, like, wow, just because we're making a buck off all these posts these people are doing, we probably shouldn't be hosting this content. But I still think that, it took them too long, and I'm dubious about the reasons why they're doing it. That said, though, we've tended to focus on overt hate. That is not how hate spreads in the modern media landscape. It spreads covertly. They will take sort of banal symbols. I've jokingly said, somebody can arguing about waffles and pancakes. They could sort of take a side on the waffles pancakes debate and sort of make that a white nationalist position. And then all of a sudden the pancake becomes the symbol of neo-Nazis, right? And the average person just sees pancakes, right? But it is a secret code that allows for radicalization and message dissemination. I think the crucial next piece is going to be where we start to realize that the rules of traditional media, where you control for content, that's no longer going to be the case in the social media landscape. You're going to have to control for intent. And that's going to be a considerably harder challenge, but I think that's the next one we as critical consumers of information have to make, is that when you see something trending online, check to see if it's being co-opted and check to see what is the subtext of the message that you're putting out.
Great, thank you, Bond. So there's certainly a lot of things that we can do as educators at university levels, but also with regards to the broader corporate platforms and the state, and with regards to regulating it. And I more recently saw an ad by Facebook, and I don't know whether you recall, you might be too young, some of these floppy disks when they were referring to internet regulation. That was the last time when there was a more broader national or even global debate on these issues. And so that Facebook is even pushing for regulation, for better or worse, of course, right? Because they certainly are an important stakeholder. And I wanted to linger a little bit on the data part and the idea of content, and shift over to Venice again, since you made this also part of your bigger interrogation, and you mentioned your students, right? And maybe you can reflect also on what can we do in the classroom, because some of the questions were here already. How can we see what's happening on the ground when we don't get the right information? So it hovers around the question of digital literacy, and maybe you can share from your experience, Venice, and bring it also in a broader context with regards to institutional and structural and racial violence here in the US with regards to Black Lives Matter, and how that also plays out in our classroom. I'd love to hear some of your thoughts here.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Arno. So I think that there's two very important parts to discuss when we talk both about sort of practical applications, right? And Sujachna obviously spoke about that absolutely beautifully. The first has to do with this, the net widening when it comes to thinking about human trafficking. And that we have to be very careful. I mean, this is an old conversation. We have to keep having it about that there are very, very many different kinds of ways in which people can engage in using their bodies to make money, right? And if we're going to be talking about sex work, if we're going to be talking about sex trafficking, we have to make sure that we're not sort of collapsing all of these different categories of, you know, for example, juveniles who are trafficked for sex and who get their documents taken away, and who are sometimes even literally chained to beds, right? That is not the same as people who engage in sex work in voluntary ways, and who sometimes, often, in fact, even organize in order to protect their right to use their body as they see fit as adults, engaging in consensual behavior. So that, you know, and one of the issues with the Violence Against Women Act was that it sort of engaged the criminal justice system in a variety of different ways to punish people when they were seen as victimizing. And I think that that ties in quite a lot to what we've been seeing with the Black Lives Matter movement, is the use that traditionally in the United States, white feminists have used tools such as the Violence Against Women Act to use the criminal justice system as a blunt instrument to fix these different problems of the victimized white woman, if you will, right? And that where we expand our use of the criminal justice system, we are not simply just protecting victims. First of all, it doesn't help victims. There's all sorts of reasons why our criminal justice system is actually a complete failure at serving victims, other than simply caging people. But also that when we use punitive measures, the people whom we are going to impact, the people who are actually going to be caged, are generally Black and brown, mostly low-level offenders who are engaging in property and drug crimes. And then when we use this symbol of a poor victimized women and children, right? Remember what I said about Cynthia Enloe, right? Collapsing that women and children in this poor white woman or white girl. Again, I talk about taken a lot, which sounds simple, but it really is this very important symbol of how we see, of whom we are trying to protect. And that when we use the criminal justice system and these very, very expanded punitive measures, what ends up happening isn't just that we save, some poor young girl from being stolen off the streets of Paris. We actually just fill our prisons with Black and brown bodies, generally young Black men, and make money off of them, right? It sort of serves this prison industrial complex in ways that perhaps were unintended, and certainly people don't think of making all those different connections, but it ends up right here's our Fawzia earlier was talking about connecting these dots, right, and talking about capitalism and the ways in which capitalism connects to all of these different things, right? But as we fill our prisons, we fill the pockets of the corporate sort of corporations that are making billions upon billions and upon billions of dollars off of these people being caged. And then frankly, not even just being caged, but when they get out, also monetizing their reentry into the community also, right? So that we use victims to cage people to make money off of their bodies. And we aren't just caging anybody, right? We're caging very specific populations, and we're using this expanded state, this expanded criminal justice system in the form of police, in the form of corrections officers, probation officers, parole officers, all of these different pieces of our criminal justice system, even reentry services, right? The revolution will not be funded. Even people who are trying in nonprofits to do their best are still expanding this system that is making money off of Black and brown bodies in the service of poor white lady victims that need our help to get their, clothes back, their bra back on their shoulder, right? So all of these connections, right? Everything that Fawzi was talking about, making all these connections of things that seem very, very disparate are actually just all in the same service.
Great. Thank you so much, Venice, for these thoughtful comments. And it's certainly some of your thoughts and ideas that you express here remind me of Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow. And so that certainly also captures how our system is geared towards sort of promoting a certain machinery that comes at the cost of other, and especially minority and social groups of color. And I want to shift it and hopefully give it a bit of a brighter note, if not brighter note, at least than one of an empowering sort. And on that note, Fawzia, can you tell us a bit more about I believe it was a play that you mentioned earlier, and can you maybe help us, the viewers and listeners, then to frame that also in terms of what can art do to sort of tackle and really grapple with some of the issues at hand that we are trying to address today. Thanks. Floor's all yours.
So, I'm just so, I'm enjoying listening to everybody, if enjoying is the right word, but certainly seeing how we're all concerned with analyzing and understanding very complicated issues, the way that the complexly a complexly interwoven nature of the problem, which makes solutions, I think, in a way, very hard because it's endemic, it's structural. And I think that is what everybody here is talking about from our own disciplinary points of view. But the last thing you just said, Arno, about what can art, the function or the role that art can play in, I don't think art can it can't correct what some of these really oppressive and very unjust structures are that keep perpetuating themselves. But I think what it can do, and what those of us who are drawn to art activism can do, is to really do what we're doing here, all of us, which is to highlight those issues, to bring them to the public. And art, in this case, this play that I want to talk to you all about a little bit, it brought to the fore a story, to the story of one woman and several other of her compatriots, Bangladeshi women trafficked as part of this, mass migration of people. It tackled it in a way that made us see them as humans, right? And also visible, not invisible statistics, but real people. And art can touch you in that way. And I think a lot of people who saw the play, and I was there when it was initially performed, it was very moving. And it also was moving because it was the first time that there was a co-production between Bangladeshi artists and Pakistani ones, because as you know, we had a war. Bangladesh used to be East Pakistan. It split away. There were horrors committed primarily on women's bodies by members of the Pakistan army. And of course, India was very much implicated in this, politically, in certain ways, to aiding and abetting. But this was a play that brought those people together, but again, over the figures of women who are, yes, victimized. Like the central character in this play, the name of the play is Dukhini. I can try to write it in a chat, but it's Dukhini. And it means the suffering one. But the suffering one, who is this main character, she refuses victimhood. Several people here have alluded to this, right? This need to not get boxed into what is our typical response. Oh, those poor women who need rescuing. Yes, these women need rescuing, but from what? They need, and that's a question that in this very Brechtian performance is raised when we as the audience are asked, are you responsible also for what has happened to these women whose lives seem so remote to yours, right? Because we all participate in a system that allows for this kind of thing to happen. And in the context of the play, these women, when they are trafficked, and the central character, Dukhini, she sets herself ablaze in a public square, not in a private square, as a way to draw attention to a problem that the governments of all these countries are trying to shove under the rug, right? Because these are just statistics and some people are doing this and we don't want to draw attention in a big way. But when that happens, that also allows for a connection, a true feminist connection with other victims in the play who are also women who are trafficked, who hear and they see this is all over the papers, all over the media, right? This woman lighting fire to herself, and they start coming to her gravesite and they form bonds that help them in a way to, if not escape that cycle, to give the audience some hope that in that connection and in trying to find ways to resolve all of the problems that they face, that may be a way forward. But the real culprit, you see, is this nexus of capitalism, which has destroyed under the neoliberal globalization regime, destroyed, it has taken away, let's say, the possibility for people to find meaningful occupation at decent wages. And so you have created a population, in this case, largely women, who turn to migrant work because they have to make ends meet. And then when their parents sell them off, to people who promise them, traffickers say, oh no, we're just taking them to marry a nice man in Pakistan, another nice Muslim man or whatever. The parents want to believe that because it's one less mouth to feed, that to a female mouth, right? Who is less important in the patriarchal structure. And they don't want to hear, what's really happening with these women, their daughters, their sisters, their, the women that have gone away from them. Because in the play, one of the most powerful moments is when a feminist NGO worker says, oh my God, see, once this woman has burnt herself and all of the, she can now take that back as an example to the parents to say, you see, this is what's happening to your daughters. And why don't you sign this document that I can use to petition the governments, in South Asia and demand that they repatriate these women back to the home so that they are not subjected to human trafficking. And the parents, first of all, refuse to believe. And when they are forced by this NGO worker, feminist, right, to sign, they say, no, we're not going to sign because we need the money that our daughters send back to us. How do you expect us to survive, right, in this economic environment? And that economic environment that I was talking about, that this play focuses on, which is, at the turn of the century, we are now 20 plus years into the next one, hasn't gone away. It's gotten worse. And our own COVID era has highlighted these issues. They are in our face. So if we don't tackle some of these issues now, I don't know when and how we will.
Thank you so much, Fazia. How you sort of really try and critically analyze also the role of art, because oftentimes this trope of art as a vector of healing is certainly appropriate, but many times it doesn't deliver. The bar's often too high, but the silver lining here is just with that collective memory piece that you mentioned here with the shrine. If it's just for them to get together and having a relationship, a connection, so that potentially they can mobilize and organize, I think brings us back sort of to the initial question. And I want to sort of close here the part two with regards to Sudeshna's work, and she mentioned these organizations maybe, and I try to tie maybe a question or two in here, because we did get quite a few questions, and as always time is running out, which is always a good sign, but it'll be great, Sudeshna, if you could tell us a bit the way forward. How does sort of the grassroots efforts, the things civil society do, intermesh and then empower potential change also at the national level in India, but then also at the global level, whether you can tease out some of the challenges, since you do work on global governance issues as well, that'll be great.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, it's been a fantastic discussion, and I'm so excited. I've been like taking notes all afternoon. But I think I would want to start, because I'm a political theorist, so I'm going to start with the importance of language in this case. I mean, Joe Biden came into office, and one of the first things he did was introduce a new immigration law. And I was really happy to see how he changed the language of immigration. I'm an immigrant, and I've always laughed about how we are known as resident or non-resident aliens. And, you know, once he decided to move away from that kind of language, I think it's very respectful and important. So I would want to start there. A lot of my beef with India's anti-trafficking laws, or a lot of like global governance structures, is the language they use. It's the victimhood and the gendered assumptions, the racialized assumptions are embedded in the policy language. So that is something that sex workers in India are addressing now. India's anti-trafficking law, it has been updated quite some times, but the language is still something that reflects the 1950s kind of state-centric government logic. It's a very state's patrimonial concern to protect its citizens. So I think I would lead with that suggestion. The next is closely linked to language, which is the criminalization narrative. I think we need to understand that, yes, crime is real, human trafficking is a crime, but we need to move away from solutions that focus just on curbing crime and curbing borders and ensuring more security, because even crime is nuanced. There is a whole like gender, ethnicity, racial dynamic to who engages in crime, like Fauziya very beautifully said. I mean, it's crime and human rights violations are something that we have the privilege of talking about and making conjectures on, sitting in the luxury of our homes here. But there are people in the global South specifically who, for them, it's just a matter of survival. So we need to look at these things through a very intersectional lens. And thirdly, and this question actually was raised by someone in the chat box, is basically like, what's the way forward in terms of organizations, and what can organizations do? I think the Indian sex workers movement does leave us with a few very significant lessons. One of my colleagues at Texas A&M Sociology Department, she works on the HIV/AIDS aspect of sex workers movement in India. And one of her recent books, which was published last year, kind of spoke to how the HIV, once the government of India did not really succeed in curbing HIV, they kind of gave power away and decentered the policies and made sex workers one of the frontline workers to kind of address STIs and HIV issues. And sex workers have been successful in raising awareness. So I think we need to go back and look at the value of grassroots organizing, grassroots education, teaching people things about gender violence and health security, but kind of putting people who've lived through the process on the front lines. And not just in terms of sex work activist organizations. I think there's a lot to kind of explore now with so many anti-racist debates happening. I think there's a tremendous like collaborative potential between feminist organizations, anti-trafficking organizations, anti-fascist organizations, and sex workers. So, and this is increasingly important because this is not just about human trafficking and crime and law, but it has a very significant spillover effect when it comes to even feminist movement. Sex workers, problems with the law and the policy, they have similar problems with the mainstream feminist movement as well. And I was just telling the panelists the other day about my paper on the #MeToo and how sex workers have been excluded from the MeToo movement. And just, I think, a week back, there's a beautiful book co-edited by sex worker activists in the US. It's called We Too, and it's the sex workers take on the Me Too movement, which I think is a terrific thing that you could probably look at. And I think it's very important to address these issues, not conflate human trafficking with sex trafficking in the first place, and take a more intersectional, holistic approach.
Thank you so much, Sudeshna. And I hope, because there were a number of questions that were addressed to you and longer questions, but given sort of the scope, how you address global public health policies with regards to India, I hope some of the questions that were asked either in the chat or from the audience, and when some of you were registering, have been answered. I want to highlight, in the interest of time, a couple of questions that that could be addressed to the panel as a whole. And while we might not have an immigration specialist here, is Mark Matias asks what the most challenging human trafficking components with respects to the current and ever-changing immigration policies are. So how can we maybe, because migration/immigration is a big part of the equation, and that enables, often doesn't stop human trafficking networks. And so is there anything with regards to either the US or with regards to India and the global South that you, any of the panelists would like to say in this regard? So are there any sort of connections with regards to US migration policies that either, and again, we've talked a lot about sex work, but Fazia wisely so mentioned that labor trafficking is a big issue. And last year, about the same time, we did hold with the MIGHT initiative, which was sort of pre-center, we did hold a big event on labor trafficking here in the US. And I do believe that the US has a duty, the US government that is, to cope with questions of immigration, because it certainly will make the lives of others easier with regards to being respected and having the same privileges and protective measures when they go to work, right? Whether that is sexual harassment, when we talk about some of the female workers laborers on the ground, but also with regards to equal pay and just with regards to being considered a human being and not being exploited and being treated as if we were just objects that need to either harvest tomatoes or do labor work in the fields, right? And so as disposable, basically, labor rather than as an integral part of our economic system. Is there any other thoughts on this, or otherwise we'll go to one of the next questions. We did have another question on whether there are many cases here in the area. Unfortunately, our panelist that could have answered that question is out for public health reasons. She was able to get her first vaccine, so we'll have to table that question for when we continue some of our conversations in this regard. But maybe what we could also think about, and this is also a broader question that was asked in the chat by Melissa Velez, with regards to this idea of banal, right, language. And I think that reminds us of Dr. Hannah Arendt's description of the banality of evil, right? When we think about the Eichmann trial. And so maybe that brings us back what Sudeshna, but also Fazia and some of us implicitly have pointed to when we think about these notions of how do we talk about this, right? And ties into victimology issues and what patterns of a victim do we have? Does this actually empower the victim, or is the victim then being instrumentalized for a different purpose? So if any one of you wants to sort of tackle that question, and so that it's more probably a reflection than a proper answer.
I mean, I can kind of give one sort of brief take, and that is that looking at the how human trafficking is constructed, I believe one of the other questions that we saw dealt with how do we raise awareness about this? Like, how do we engage people about this? And I think that's a compelling question. One of the research projects that we did prior to this one is that we did kind of an analytical process looking at every superhero comic book since 1991 that has dealt with the issue of human trafficking. And we thought it was great that they were engaging, particularly for young people, the topic of human trafficking. Like, this was a good thing. There was some problematic information in those stories, and that has persisted a lot in popular culture. Primarily that we don't have to think about the economic system that created the trafficking, but rather if we simply kill and punish the traffickers, we'll be in great shape. Like, that this is your remedy. And I think that's problematic because it sort of lets the systemic problems that created exploitation off the hook. And I think that's probably a bad thing. And the notion of legalistic, punitive solutions being the only approach that we can have to human trafficking also really changes the discourse away from looking at the structural problems that have facilitated the human trafficking. And to me, this is like one of the key points is that awareness is good, but what we've had too much of is that when awareness spreading is unfocused and inaccurate, it can have the exact opposite effect, right? So, like, I'm for kind of consciousness raising about issues of exploitation, but we have to make sure that it's inclusive, that all stakeholders and voices are represented in that message, but we also have to make sure that there's accuracy in the message, because that's not happening frequently enough when it comes to the topic of human trafficking.
Great, thank you so much, Bon. Anyone else? Yeah, Fazia, go ahead. You just gotta unmute yourself real quick.
So, I think what Bon said is exactly right. But the question then is, how do we fix those structural problems, right? I mean, we're really down to that. That's the big question, it seems to me, because I think in this very rich panel and, really well put together, Arno, is that everybody has spoken about, and I think we're in agreement that there are deep structural issues here that, because no attention is paid to them, we come up with these simplistic ideas and convey them in simple language to people who, then consume them and believe them and want to make them into single issue questions, right? And try to find, one person or one class of people to blame, and let's get after Hillary, or it's so-and-so is to blame, and they have a cabal, and, it's this very, for lack of a better word, it's not contextualized because there isn't, the history and the political formation, the historical formation of the system that we live in, right? That is being taught, it seems to me. So part of the question has to be with education. What are we doing in our educational institutions, starting from very young, very early on in schools, when we teach our children to protect themselves from possible child snatchers, right? I mean, how can we move from making it just a scary bogeyman issue into having even children consider in some language and conceptual language possible for them to understand that it's not that simple, that yes, they have to protect themselves, make them aware. That's a good thing to do, but that the issues are interlinked and larger, and get them to become better citizens that then can lead to, putting pressure on our elected governments to address these issues in a holistic way. We don't do that. We trying to separate out. Part of it is also a problem of disciplinarity. Political scientists will look at it and only focus on this angle. Artists, okay, you can just talk about, some nice things that happen in the field. You do this. History, no, we've got to bring these discourses together, and it has to start very early on. So for me, really, education and a very holistic kind of education is absolutely key.
Great, I see Venice, you had your virtual hand up, please chime in.
Yeah, I just, I wanted to bring up a couple of things that I know that, as a feminist, I frame myself as an intersectional feminist. I know that people might sometimes find it difficult to understand a criticism of VAWA, right, of the Violence Against Women Act. And also in that, also the question of sort of defending sex work. So I just want to sort of go back. I mean, I have been talking about it for many years, so sometimes I do it quickly, but I just want to make sure that people understand, there are so many ways to respond to victimization. The point is not that victimization isn't a problem. Victimization is a massive, massive problem, particularly for people from underserved communities, particularly for women, and for marginalized identities in all different sort of ways along the gender spectrum and in all different communities, right? Victimization is a problem and it needs to be stopped. It needs to be curbed and ideally stopped. That doesn't mean that the way that we approach stopping it or curbing it is with a punitive response, is by increasing penalties, by increasing sentences. What we know from decades upon decades upon decades of research is that punishment responses are not what are going to work. And also speaking to Fazia's point, this boogeyman question, right? We know that the vast majority of people, if we're so worried about rape victims, if we're so worried about child abuse survivors, if we're so worried about these populations, then we should not be worried about random traffickers in back alleys, because they're not the real risk. What we should be worried about is people who love and are loved by those women and those children, those women and children, right? That we are using VAWA to pretend that the problem, number one, is strangers, and number two, that we can fix the problem by caging people and by expanding this public system, right, that then funds capitalism, right, and feeds into capitalism. So when I criticize VAWA, it is certainly not because I'm interested in being against people who are trying to care for victims. My point is just simply that the way that they are caring for victims, A, has racist and misogynist roots that they may not be aware of, but B, that it's ineffective. And it may make us feel good, but it's ineffective. And so that if we reimagine a way to serve victims, in the end, reframing perhaps our criminal justice system as a victims' justice system, which it currently isn't at all. It doesn't serve victims at all. In fact, it's really quite damaging to victims in all of these many different ways. So if we're really looking to serve victims, VAWA is the wrong way to do it. So A, and then B, the question of and yes, Fazia's point, it's all about the economy, right? It ends up coming back down to money and who's making money and how do we make money off of sort of poor and disenfranchised people. And then the second piece about sex work never being voluntary, you can go back to the Barnard Sex Wars Conference, right? All these different places where we have these discussions. But really all you need to do is take a look at OnlyFans, right? People are making money. And before that, you can take a look at Backpage or Craigslist, right? All of these different places where people are actually using their own agency, using their own adults, right? We're talking about adults here. If we're talking about children, it's a whole different deal. But when we're talking about adults, there are all these places where the internet actually gave people a chance to bypass pimps, to bypass people who were making money off of their bodies and make money off of their own bodies and have their own agency. And it's telling, in fact, that those keep getting shut down over and over and over again when people, not just women, all sorts of different people are trying to make money off of their own bodies in ways that they want to and that they can and frankly should be legal, so that if we really want to focus our attention on the people that really need our help, like children, like people who are being victimized, then we need to leave well enough alone the people on, for example, OnlyFans, let them do their thing and stop pulling all of them together into one big women and children blob and take out the pieces of the people that we need to actually help and figure out ways that actually work.
Thank you so much, Venice. And we're running out of time, but I want to sort of give Bond one more second to respond, to sort of bring it all to full circle with QAnon related issues, and then we'll wrap it up for today. But it's certainly a sign that this discussion and panel sparked a lot of debate, and it's the beginning of a journey that we're taking together with many more events to come. So Bond, please, and then we'll wrap it up.
There is a lot to sort of unpack here, but I think one of the biggest things that, if we can kind of take it away, is that I think that we have to be really, really careful. And I think that this is the broader message. We have to be really careful that when we hear something that sounds noble, right? Like right to work, for example, sounds like really good thing. You'll see these sort of noble sounding euphemisms that are out there. And it's really easy to say, I support this thing, right? Like who doesn't love, you know, like the puppies, who doesn't want to stop the exploitation of children, right? Like there is, but then you get pulled down to a rabbit hole very, very quickly where in the process of saying, you know, like I dislike this obviously bad thing, you know who's behind the bad thing, don't you? You know, like there's probably an elite group of people, and you know what is their religious orientation? Like before you know it, you can be pulled into something incredibly hateful, right? And it's something that we see all the time where people in the process of just engaging in discourse, right? Like I think that one of the worst things that I've seen to come out of all of this, and as both my research colleague and I have developed a national prominence in discussing this issue, like one of the things that we've had that's been terrible is that we've had people say that by questioning QAnon, you're defending the traffickers. And I think that is an incredibly superficial reading of this. And this reflexive defensiveness on the part of this, where the fact that we even question the response that we're doing right now to human trafficking, that we want to look at systemic problems as opposed to direct punitive criminal prosecution, like the fact that we even want to have that discussion means that you're on the side of the traffickers. I think that's remarkably dismissive. And I think that quelling of discourse ultimately hurts. And I hope that this discourse can continue, because I think that there's really no benefit in hiding in the myths. I think that we have to confront the realities.
Thank you so much for these parting words, Bond, and thank you so much to all of our esteemed panelists today. I think we were really trying to square the circle here, and instead we've opened up Pandora's box, but I think it's important, and I think civilized discussions are important where we shed light on different issues from very different angles, and I'm very, very happy that I was able to join this roundtable with such an esteemed round of colleagues and faculty members. And so I would just urge you to stay in touch, see what the center is doing on their website, reach out to us individually or to the center, and stay tuned. This recording will go into a post-production, and then there'll be a post-event sort of video available on different platforms. And we hope that the interest is here for many more events of a similar nature. And as I said, some of the colleagues that work more locally with regards to New Jersey and New York City, or the greater New York metropolitan area, will be on in the near future. And so we hope to see you again soon. And be well, stay safe, and thanks for joining us today. Bye-bye.